Let me tell you about the day Carol Hollister, HOA board president, self-appointed queen of Maplewood Estates, and the single most insufferable human being I have ever had the misfortune of living near, physically stepped in front of a heating oil delivery truck in the middle of a snowstorm and waved it away like she was directing airport traffic. And then, about 4 days later, called me sobbing at 11 o'clock at night because her boiler had run completely dry and her house was 42 degrees. I am not exaggerating a single word of that. I have been living at 14 Birchwood Lane in Maplewood Estates for going on 7 years now. When I bought the house, I knew it was an HOA community. I had read the CC and RS, skimmed the bylaws, and figured it would mostly mean keeping my lawn tidy and not painting my front door neon green. That was naive of me, very naive, because I had not yet met Carol Hollister. Carol had been on the HOA board for 11 years when I moved in. She had been the president for the last 6 of those years. She lived in the house directly across the street from me, a large colonial with holiday decorations that somehow went up the week before Halloween and stayed up until mid-March, which she apparently decided was exempt from her own bylaw about seasonal decorations being removed within 30 days of the holiday. She drove a white SUV that she parked approximately 6 inches over her property line in every direction. She had opinions about your trash cans, your guests, your doorbell camera angle, and the precise shade of beige you were allowed to use when repainting your shutters. I had tangled with Carol before, a few minor skirmishes over the years. She sent me a violation notice once because my basketball hoop was visible from the street at an angle she deemed unattractive. Another time she tried to fine me because a friend of mine had parked a pickup truck in my driveway for a weekend, and she claimed commercial vehicles were prohibited. The truck was my buddy Dave's personal F-150 that he used to haul his kayaks. I sent her back a 2-paragraph letter citing the actual definition of a commercial vehicle as outlined in our HOA documents and never heard about it again. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compared to what she pulled that January. We had gotten hammered that winter. 2 back-to-back snowstorms in December, then a brief thaw that turned everything to ice, and then January came in swinging. We got 14 inches in the first week alone. The roads in Maplewood Estates were a mess. The HOA had a contract with a plowing company, and those guys were doing their best, but the side streets were still narrow and slippery, and navigating any kind of large vehicle through the neighborhood was genuinely tricky. I had my heating oil delivered by a company called Barlow Energy, a small local outfit that had been serving our area for over 20 years. My house runs on oil heat, and so do about a dozen other houses in Maplewood Estates. Every year around late December or early January, Barlow sends a truck out to top everyone off before the deep cold sets in. They had been coming to this neighborhood for years. Their driver, a big, good-natured guy named Pete, knew the streets well, knew which driveways were tight, and had never had a problem. That particular Tuesday morning, I had gotten up early to shovel my walkway and the apron of my driveway. The storm had dropped another 6 inches overnight and everything was buried again. I was out there at about 7 in the morning, throwing snow, breath coming out in clouds, when I saw Pete's truck turn onto Birchwood Lane. The truck was distinctive. Big orange tanker, BARLOW Energy printed in black letters on the side. Chains on the rear wheels because Pete was smart about winter driving. I waved at him, and he waved back through the windshield, started pulling up toward my house. That is when Carol Hollister came outside. She had on a long puffy coat, a knit hat and boots, and she walked out into the middle of the street with the confidence of someone who had never once in her life considered the possibility that she might be wrong about anything. She held up both hands like she was stopping traffic. Pete slowed down and rolled his window down. I stopped shoveling and just watched, because immediately I knew this was going to be a thing. "You cannot bring that vehicle through here," Carol said. She said it the way a person says something they have been waiting to say. Like she had been rehearsing, Pete looked confused, understandably. "Ma'am, I'm here for scheduled oil deliveries. I've been coming to this neighborhood for years." "That is a commercial vehicle," Carol said. "Our HOA bylaws prohibit commercial vehicles from operating on private HOA roads during off-peak hours, and furthermore, that truck is too wide for the current road conditions. You are creating a safety hazard." I want to pause here and explain a few things. First, the bylaw she was referencing did exist, technically. There was a clause about commercial vehicles and private roads. But it applied to things like semi-trucks making deliveries to businesses, not residential service vehicles. Heating oil trucks, propane trucks, plumbers' vans, all of that was standard residential service and had never in 7 years been challenged. Second, there was no specification in the bylaws about what counted as off-peak hours, because that phrase did not actually appear in our documents anywhere. She made that part up entirely. Third, Pete's truck fit on the road fine. It was not a tractor-trailer. It was a mid-size oil tanker. I had watched it navigate this street in worse conditions than this. But Carol was standing in the road with her hands up, and Pete, because he is a professional and a genuinely decent human being who does not want to run over an HOA president, stopped the truck. I walked over. "Carol, what are you doing?" "I'm enforcing community standards, Andrew," she said without looking at me. She was still staring at Pete like she was a crossing guard. "He has a scheduled delivery. That's my oil truck. And he can reschedule for a compliant time and route. I'm going to have to ask him to turn around." She turned to Pete. "Sir, please back the vehicle out of the community." Pete looked at me. I looked at Pete. I then looked at Carol. "Carol," I said, and I tried to keep my voice steady, "you do not have the authority to turn away a residential service vehicle. The HOA rules on commercial vehicles are not applicable here, and you know that." "I am the board president," she said, like that settled everything. "That does not give you the right to physically block someone's service provider." She squared her shoulders. "I'm calling the HOA attorney." She pulled out her phone and stepped back toward her driveway, and Pete leaned out his window and looked at me. "Man, I am so sorry. I don't want to make this worse for you. I got 4 other stops in the neighborhood too, FYI. A few of your neighbors are on this run." 4 other stops. So it was not just me she was blocking. She was preventing at least 4 other households from getting their heating oil topped off in the middle of a January cold snap. "Pete," I said, "pull into my driveway. You have a legal right to service a private residence, and I'm giving you explicit permission to be on my property. Whatever she says to you, you've got documented permission from the homeowner." Pete nodded, and he pulled his truck into my driveway. Carol watched this with an expression like she had bitten into a lemon. She got off the phone with whoever she had called, walked back over to my driveway, and said, "I've left a message with the HOA attorney. I'm issuing you a formal notice of violation, Andrew, and the driver is going to hear from us as well." I want to be clear. I did not yell. I did not swear. I asked her calmly and clearly to put her specific legal basis for the violation in writing, to cite the exact bylaw number and section, and to provide it to me within the time frame required by our HOA dispute resolution process. I had read those documents, all of them, more than once. She hesitated just slightly. Then she said, "You'll receive it in writing." She went back inside. Pete did my delivery, filled my tank right up, and then I walked him around the block to the other 4 homes that were on his list. 2 of them, the Pattersons on Elm Court and old Mr. Finch on Maple Drive, came out and thanked Pete personally for coming in this weather. None of them had any idea Carol had tried to turn him away. They were going to find out soon enough. Here is where I have to tell you a bit about my situation because it matters to the rest of the story. I work from home. I am a paralegal, and I do freelance contract review on the side. I have read more legal documents than most people will ever see in their lifetime. I say this not to brag, but because it is relevant to how I handled what came next. I know how to read bylaws. I know what HOA boards can and cannot do. And I know how to document things in a way that holds up later. So that afternoon, I sat down at my desk, and I wrote a very detailed, very polite, very thorough email to the full HOA board. Not just Carol, all 5 members. I outlined the sequence of events that morning. I described Carol physically positioning herself in the road to prevent a residential service vehicle from accessing the neighborhood. I cited the specific bylaw she had referenced and explained, with direct quotes from the document, why it did not apply to residential heating oil delivery. I requested a written response within 10 business days. I CC'd Barlow Energy. And then I went and pulled the footage from my driveway security camera and my doorbell camera, which had captured the whole thing. Carol standing in the road, her blocking Pete, the conversation, all of it. Crystal clear, time-stamped. I saved all of it. 2 days later, I got a formal violation notice in my mailbox, just like Carol had promised. It cited a bylaw, Section 427, about commercial vehicle access, and it levied a $50 fine. It was signed by Carol Hollister as board president. I had been expecting this, so I was not surprised. I sent a formal written dispute the same day, citing my earlier email, the security footage, and a point-by-point rebuttal of the violation. I also included a separate concern, which was that Carol, as a named party in the dispute I was filing, had a clear conflict of interest in signing the violation notice and should have recused herself from that decision. That was a process violation on the HOA's part, and it actually mattered. I also made a few phone calls. The first was to my neighbor Deb Patterson, whose family was one of the 4 other households affected by Carol's blockade. Deb was furious when she heard the full story. She had not realized that Carol had tried to block the truck. She had just seen Pete arrive and assumed everything was fine. When I explained that Carol had physically stepped in front of the truck and that she had sent me a violation notice, Deb said words I will not repeat and asked what she could do to help. The second call was to Mr. Finch, who was 73 years old and lived alone, and who told me very quietly that if his heat had gone out, he did not have a backup plan. He had electric space heaters, but the house was old and drafty, and he genuinely depended on that oil delivery. He was not dramatic about it. He just said it matter-of-factly, which somehow made it worse. The third call I made was to a contact of mine, a real estate attorney named Linda who occasionally threw contract work my way. I described the situation to her and asked if there was any pathway where what Carol had done crossed from just being an HOA power trip into something with actual legal exposure. Linda was quiet for a moment and then said, "You're telling me she physically blocked access to a service vehicle on a public road to prevent contracted deliveries?" I clarified that the Birchwood Lane section of the road was technically HOA private. She said, "Okay, so it's HOA private property." But here's the thing. She doesn't own it. The HOA collectively manages it. One board member cannot unilaterally restrict access to a service vehicle without a board vote. Did the board vote on this? I told her I was almost certain they had not. Linda said, if she's acting outside her authority, she's creating liability for the HOA and potentially for herself. I thanked Linda, took notes, and added that to my documentation. In the meantime, I had reached out to the other 3 households on Pete's delivery route and found out that 2 of them had received similar violation notices. Nobody had been warned, nobody had been consulted, and nobody had voted. Carol had just decided on her own that Tuesday morning that she was going to stop the oil truck. That was when things started to come together in an interesting way, because I was not the only person who had camera footage. Tom Garrett on Birchwood, 2 houses down from me, had a Ring camera that covered the street, and it had captured Carol walking out into the road before Pete's truck had even fully turned onto the lane. She had come out of her house almost like she was watching for him, like she had been waiting, like she knew the truck was coming. Now, how would Carol have known the truck's schedule? Barlow Energy did not publish their routes publicly. My delivery was on my account. So either she had found out through some other channel, or she had specifically gone out because she saw the truck coming down the main road. Either way, Tom's camera showed her exit her house before Pete had even made the turn, which suggested a degree of preparation that made the whole thing feel a lot less like a spontaneous decision about safety, and a lot more like she had been planning this. I shared that observation with Linda, who told me not to get too conspiratorial, but agreed it was worth noting in any documentation going forward. The violation notices continued to pile up. Over the next few days, 2 more households got notices for various things. One was the Nuyens on Maple Court, who had gotten fined $50 because their trash cans were still at the curb at 4 in the afternoon on pickup day, an hour before the deadline in the bylaws. Another was a young couple, the Beckers, who had just moved in 6 months earlier and got a notice because their welcome mat was the wrong material, which was supposedly in violation of some section about exterior decor. Carol was apparently on a roll. The board seemed to just be rubber stamping whatever she put in front of them. I organized a neighborhood meeting. I sent emails to everyone I knew on the street and asked them to come over on Saturday afternoon, bring their coffee, and let us talk through what was happening. About 14 households showed up, which for a cold January Saturday was a pretty remarkable turnout. People were crowded into my living room, some sitting on the floor, some standing in the hallway, and I laid everything out. The oil truck incident, the footage from both cameras, the violation notices, Carol's apparent unilateral decision-making without a board vote, the conflict of interest issue, the pattern of escalating fines. I also pointed out that under our HOA bylaws, any fine over $30 required ratification by a majority of the board at a scheduled meeting, which meant Carol's $50 violation notices might not even be procedurally valid. People were not happy. Not yelling, not dramatic, just the quiet, determined kind of unhappy that actually gets things done. The Pattersons were there, and Deb was quietly furious. Mr. Finch was there, sitting in my armchair, sipping tea and saying very little but nodding at everything. The Nuyens were there and Mrs. Nuyen, who was normally soft-spoken and friendly, said she was tired of feeling like she was living under surveillance in her own neighborhood. The Beckers, the new couple, looked shell-shocked because they had moved in expecting a nice quiet community and had instead received a violation notice about their welcome mat. I laid out a plan. First, we were going to collectively dispute every outstanding violation notice on procedural grounds, arguing that they had not been properly ratified by the board. Second, we were going to formally request, in writing, copies of the minutes from every board meeting held in the past 12 months, because HOA members had the legal right to access those records, and if Carol had been making these decisions without proper votes, the minutes would either prove it or show that the minutes were being falsified. Third, we were going to request a special community meeting under the provision in our bylaws that allowed any group of 10 or more homeowners to call one, and we were going to put forward a formal motion to censure Carol and review her conduct as board president. I want to be clear that none of this was revenge. Well, okay, maybe a little of it was, but mostly it was legitimate, lawful, and frankly long overdue. We got the meeting minutes request in within the week. Carol stalled, citing administrative burden, which was itself a violation of our state's HOA transparency statute, which required records to be produced within 15 business days. I made a note of that. The special community meeting request went in with 15 homeowner signatures, well above the 10 required. Under our bylaws, the board was obligated to schedule a special meeting within 30 days. Carol sent back a brief response saying the request had been received. She gave no meeting date. That 30-day clock started ticking. Around day 10 of that waiting period, 2 things happened in quick succession that I did not see coming. The first was that I got a call from Pete at Barlow Energy. He had been talking to his dispatcher, and apparently the dispatcher had gone back through the account records after I mentioned the situation to them. What they found was that 2 of the 5 households Carol had blocked on that delivery day, households that had been expecting oil and had not gotten their full delivery because Carol had delayed the route and cost Pete time, had called back the following week to reschedule. One of those households had a delivery scheduled for the next week. The other, however, had not called back at all, and that second household Pete's dispatcher quietly let slip was at the address directly across the street from mine, Carol Hollister. Carol was an oil heat customer too, same company, and she had not rescheduled her delivery. Now, I want to be very careful here about what I did with that information. I did not make any calls or do anything that could be considered harassment or interference. I just filed it away mentally and went about my day. But I did note, looking across the street at her Colonial, that I had not seen a Barlow truck go to her house in the past week, and it had been getting colder, really cold. Down in the single digits at night, which for our area was unusual and pretty serious. The second thing that happened around day 10 was that I finally got the board meeting minutes back, after submitting a second request citing the state statute and giving the HOA a formal notice of noncompliance. The minutes arrived in a PDF, 40-something pages covering the past 12 months of meetings. I sat down with a coffee and went through them carefully. The violation notices Carol had issued. Never brought to a vote, not one of them. There were references to President's administrative discretion in the minutes, but nothing that resembled an actual board vote ratifying individual fines. The commercial vehicle policy she had cited. It had been discussed at one meeting 11 months ago, but the discussion had been tabled and no formal policy update had been adopted, meaning the bylaw as it existed was still the original language, which, as I had already argued, did not apply to residential service vehicles. Even better, in the minutes from 6 months ago, there was a reference to a proposed rule update that Carol had drafted herself and circulated to the board via email without a formal meeting. 3 of the 4 other board members had replied affirmatively to the email, and in the minutes Carol had logged this as a unanimous board approval. But our bylaws specified that board votes on rule changes had to occur at a properly noticed and scheduled board meeting, with a quorum present, not via email. So even that attempt to update the rule had not been done correctly. It was, to put it plainly, a mess. Carol had been running this HOA like her personal fiefdom, making decisions unilaterally, fining people without proper process, and logging questionable email exchanges as legitimate board actions. None of it was flagrantly illegal in a criminal sense, but all of it was procedurally invalid, and the fines were potentially unenforceable. I sent everything to Linda, who confirmed my read and added that the HOA might have real exposure if any homeowner had actually paid one of these invalid fines under duress. Several had, it turned out, including the Nuyens, who had paid a previous fine 3 months ago rather than deal with the stress of fighting it. That one fine based on invalid process meant the HOA had potentially collected money it had no legal right to collect. I did not immediately escalate this to a legal threat. I saved it, because the special meeting was coming and I wanted to bring everything out at once. And then, on the 14th day of that 30-day window, Carol called me. It was 11:17 at night. I know the exact time because I was still up reading, and I looked at my phone when it rang. The name on the screen was Carol Hollister, which was in my contacts because we had exchanged numbers years ago for neighborhood stuff. I genuinely considered not answering it. We had a formal dispute in process, and anything she said to me could matter, but something made me pick up, and I am still not entirely sure what. Andrew. Her voice was different. Not the clipped, authoritative Carol voice I was used to. It was smaller, strained. "I'm sorry to call so late. I have a problem." I waited. "My boiler went out," she said. "Completely. The gauge reads empty. The house is 42 degrees. I don't know what happened. I called Barlow and they said they can't get a truck out tonight and I don't know what to do." For a long moment I just held the phone. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment because it was not a simple thing. Part of me, a pretty substantial part, wanted to say something like, "Well, Carol, maybe you should have let the delivery truck through." I really did want to say that. I am only human. But another part of me remembered Mr. Finch sitting in my armchair, telling me quietly that he did not have a backup plan, and I could not quite reconcile that with the idea of Carol sitting alone in a 42-degree house. "Are you physically okay?" I asked. "Do you have any heat source at all?" "I have one electric space heater," she said. "I've got it in the bedroom, but the house is just so cold." "Did you try calling an emergency heating service?" "I called two. One is booked until tomorrow morning and one doesn't service our area." "Andrew, I know what you must be thinking, and I know I don't have any right to ask, but I don't know who else to call." I thought about it. I really did take a moment and actually think about it, which I think was the right thing to do. What I said next was not out of forgiveness, not out of weakness, and definitely not out of forgetting what she had done. It was out of a pretty basic understanding that a person being cold and alone at 42 degrees in January was a genuine problem that transcended our HOA dispute. "You need to stay warm tonight," I said. "I have a portable propane heater I can bring over. It's safe for indoor use, it's got an auto shutoff, and it'll keep a bedroom warm. Do you want me to bring it?" Silence. "Yes," she said, very quietly. I bundled up, grabbed the heater and 2 canisters of propane from my garage, and walked across the street. The cold was intense, the kind that gets into your ears and makes your eyes water immediately. The snow on her front walk had not been fully cleared, and I could see from the street that the lights inside were on, but the warmth that usually glows from a heated house was just not there. You can tell in January when a house is not heated. There is something flat and dim about it. She answered the door in a coat and gloves. Inside it was shockingly cold. I could see my breath. The house smelled like the particular coal dust smell of a furnace room that has gone quiet. I brought the heater upstairs, set it up in her bedroom, got it running, and showed her how to use it. She stood there watching me in her coat, and she looked genuinely diminished in a way I had not seen before. Not the Carol who stood in front of oil trucks, just a middle-aged woman in a cold house who had not fully thought things through. "I can also contact Barlow first thing tomorrow," I said. "Sometimes if you call early enough they can fit you in on an emergency basis. I know the dispatcher." "Andrew," she said. I looked at her. "I made a mistake." She said it plainly without a lot of preamble. "About the truck, she stopped, started again. "I had read something online about a neighborhood where commercial deliveries were restricted and property values had improved. I had this idea that the neighborhood would look better with fewer large trucks coming through in winter, and I acted on it, without thinking it through, without asking anyone. "Without a board vote," I said, because I could not help it. "Without a board vote," she agreed. We stood there in the partially heated bedroom with the propane heater humming between us, and I said, "Carol, I need you to understand that what you did affected more than just me. There are families in this neighborhood who depend on that delivery. Mr. Finch is 73 and lives alone. If his oil had run out in this cold, it could have been a serious situation. You have to understand that." She looked at the floor. "I know. And I need you to know that we have footage of the whole thing, both cameras. And I've documented the violation notices, the procedural issues with the board process, the meeting minutes, all of it. We have a special community meeting coming and people are going to ask hard questions." "I know that too," she said. I left her with the heater and walked back across the street through the freezing dark, and I am going to be honest with you, I did not feel as victorious as I thought I would. I felt tired mostly, and a little sad about the whole thing. That feeling did not last too long, though, because there was still the matter of the community meeting, the invalid fines, and the New Year's money. Barlow Energy got an emergency truck to Carol the next morning by 8:30, which I had called them about at 6:15. They were good people and they took care of it. She had her heat back by 9. She returned my propane heater the same afternoon with a handwritten note that said thank you. I kept the note. Not for any dramatic reason. I just thought it mattered to have. The special community meeting happened on day 28 of the 30-day window. The HOA board had tried to reschedule it twice, once citing a conflict with a previously scheduled board meeting. which Linda told me was not a valid reason under our bylaws, and once citing weather, which was marginally more defensible but not by much. I pushed back both times in writing, citing the 30-day obligation. They eventually scheduled it for a Thursday evening at the community center, which was a small room attached to the neighborhood pool complex that sat empty and cold all winter. Turnout was extraordinary. I had circulated information to every household in Maplewood Estates, all 47 of them. 29 households showed up, either the homeowner or, in several cases, multiple family members. That was the largest attendance at any HOA meeting in recent memory, according to a couple of the older residents who had been in the neighborhood forever. The board sat at a folding table at the front. Carol was in the center seat. She looked like she had aged a few years since that night in her bedroom. The other board members, Jim Kowalski, Sandra Pope, Terry Finn, and a newer member named Kevin Marsh who had been on for less than a year, and who I suspected did not fully understand what he had gotten himself into, all sat in various states of discomfort. I had prepared a presentation. Nothing fancy, just a printed document I had made copies of for every household in attendance, laying out the timeline of events, the relevant bylaw citations, the procedural issues with the violation notices, and the specific records request and the HOA's late compliance. I had also brought a laptop, and with permission from the homeowner, pulled up Tom Garrett's camera footage on a projector screen that was normally used for the HOA's holiday slideshow. The footage was clear. You could see Carol walking out of her house before Pete's truck had even fully turned onto the street. You could see her standing in the road with her hands up. You could hear faintly the conversation because Tom's camera had audio pickup. Her exact words were audible. "You cannot bring that vehicle through here." The room was very quiet while the footage played. I then laid out the bylaw analysis. Section 427, the commercial vehicle provision, applied specifically to vehicles engaged in commercial enterprise on HOA property, with a note that residential service vehicles were addressed in Section 429, which explicitly stated that deliveries of fuel, utilities, and residential services shall not be restricted, provided the homeowner has granted access and the vehicle operator has a documented service appointment. Pete had a scheduled appointment. I had granted access. The violation was invalid on its face. I then walked through the procedural issues with the board meeting minutes. I was careful and factual, not dramatic about it, and I watched the faces of the board members as I explained that the fines Carol had issued did not have valid board ratification. Kevin Marsh, the newer member, was visibly uncomfortable. Sandra Pope was writing something on a notepad. Jim Kowalski stared at the table. I brought up the Nguyen situation, that the Nguyens had paid a previous fine that had also been issued without proper board ratification, and I stated clearly that those funds should be returned. Carol did not interrupt me once during this. She sat with her hands folded on the table and listened. That itself surprised me. When I finished, I opened the floor for questions and comments. The next 45 minutes were something I will remember for a long time. People were not screaming. Nobody lost their temper. But resident after resident stood up and described their own experience, their own violation notices, their own feeling of being surveilled and fined without any real process, their frustration at feeling like they had no voice in how their community was run. The Beckers talked about their welcome mat. Mrs. Nguyen talked about the anxiety of receiving official-looking documents in the mail and not knowing if they were legally binding. Mr. Finch stood up slowly and said, in that quiet way of his, that he was 73 years old and he had lived in Maplewood Estates for 19 years, and he had never in his life felt less welcome in his own home than he had in the past year. That one landed. Then Deb Patterson stood up and made a formal motion from the floor, which was allowed under our bylaws during special community meetings. The motion was to censure Carol Hollister as HOA board president for acting outside her authority in the oil truck incident, for issuing fines without proper board ratification, and for failing to produce requested records within the legally required timeframe. The motion also called for a full audit of all fines issued in the past 12 months and reimbursement of any fines determined to have been improperly issued. It also requested that the board adopt a formal process for future violations, with a required board vote for any fine over $30, consistent with the bylaws. The motion required a second. Tom Garrett provided it immediately. Under our bylaws, a motion made at a special community meeting could pass with a simple majority of homeowners present. With 29 households represented, 15 was the threshold. The vote was taken by a show of hands. I counted 22 in favor. The motion passed. What happened next was interesting. Carol asked for a 5-minute recess. She conferred quietly with the other board members. Kevin Marsh, the newer one, kept nodding. Sandra Pope looked relieved in a way that made me think she had been wanting someone to do this for a while. When they came back, Carol stood up. She spoke into the microphone on the folding table and her voice was steady. Whatever else you could say about Carol, she was not a person who fell apart in public, and she said that the board accepted the motion and would comply with all of its requirements. She said the audit would begin within 2 weeks. She said any improperly issued fines would be reimbursed with interest, as provided for under the state HOA Act. And she said she would be stepping back from the role of board president, effective immediately, pending the community's decision on who should assume that role in the interim. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Jim Kowalski, of all people, moved that Sandra Pope assume the interim presidency, and Sandra, who looked like she had been waiting for this for possibly years, said she would accept. That motion passed too. On the way out of the community center, the cold hitting like a wall as the doors opened, Mr. Finch found me in the parking lot and shook my hand. He did not say a lot. He said, "Good work, son," and then went to his car, and I watched him go and thought about what it had meant to him that the heat had shown up that day back in January. How something so basic, so fundamental, was what had started all of this. In the weeks that followed, the HOA audit was completed, and it turned out that 11 households had been fined under improperly ratified notices in the past year. The total came to roughly $900, which the HOA reimbursed with a 6% interest adjustment per the state statute. The Nuyens were at the front of that list. Sandra Pope, as interim president, put together a new violation process with actual written procedures, a required board vote for any fine, a mandatory notice period, and a formal appeals process. She sent a copy to every household with a cover letter that managed to be apologetic without being sycophantic, which is a harder balance to strike than it sounds. Carol submitted her formal resignation from the board about 3 weeks after the meeting. She did not make a dramatic announcement. She just sent an email to the board saying she was stepping down completely and thanking people for the years she had served. It was, by any measure, a more graceful exit than I would have expected from her. Here is the thing about Carol Hollister that I have thought about a lot since then, and I will share it because I think it is actually the most interesting part of the whole story. She was not a monster. She was a person who had been given a little bit of authority and had let it expand in her mind to fill a much larger space than it actually occupied. She convinced herself that she was protecting the neighborhood when she was actually just controlling it, and those two things can feel exactly the same from the inside and look completely different from the outside. The oil truck thing was just the moment when the gap between those two perspectives became impossible to ignore. I also think, and I am speculating here, that some part of her understood this on some level, because she never actually tried to have the violation notices stick after the community meeting. She never lawyered up. She never sent a threatening letter. She accepted the outcome and she moved on, which in the context of HOA battles is genuinely unusual. Most of the stories you hear about these things end with years of litigation and people putting up spite fences. This one ended with a functional board, reimbursed fines, and a neighborhood that was actually talking to each other more than it had in years. The Barlow Energy situation had one more footnote that I enjoyed. Pete, the driver, called me in late January to say that his company had sent a letter to the HOA, noting that any interference with scheduled service deliveries in the future could constitute grounds for the company to terminate service to the entire neighborhood, which would have been a pretty significant inconvenience for the 12 households in Maplewood Estates that used them. He said the dispatcher had been wanting to send that letter for a while, and the incident had given them the push they needed. Sandra Pope, as the new interim president, sent back a response acknowledging the concern and confirming that the HOA had no policy restricting residential service vehicles, which was a sentence that I think Pete probably appreciated quite a bit. February came and the cold kept going, but the neighborhood felt different. Deb Patterson organized a sidewalk shoveling brigade for Mr. Finch, because his driveway was long and his back was not great, and 6 or 7 households started rotating through to help him out on heavy snow days. It was not something that came from a memo or an HOA initiative. It just happened because people were paying attention to each other in a way they had not been before. The Beckers, the new couple who had gotten the welcome mat notice, ended up becoming friendly with pretty much everyone on the block over the course of that winter. They started hosting impromptu soup nights on Sundays, which became a genuinely regular thing. At one of those Sunday soup nights in late February, Deb Patterson told a story that made the whole room laugh, about the moment she had realized the oil truck situation was going to become a bigger deal. She said she had been watching from her window when Carol walked out in front of Pete's truck, and her first thought was, "Oh no, here we go." And her second thought was, "Andrew is going to handle this," which was apparently a level of confidence in me that I was not entirely sure I had earned but was willing to accept. I brought up the story about driving the propane heater across the street at 11:30 at night, and the room had mixed reactions. A couple of people thought it was funny. Tom Garrett said I was too nice. Mr. Finch just nodded slowly and said, "No, that was right. I tend to agree with Mr. Finch on most things." Someone at the soup night asked me if I felt like it had all been worth it, the months of documentation, the legal research, the community organizing, the meeting. I thought about it and said yes, not just because of the outcome, but because I think there is something important about not letting small abuses of authority go unchallenged. Not in a combative way, not in a way that makes everything a war, but in a way that says, clearly and calmly, this is not how things work here, and these are the rules, and they apply to everyone including the person who is supposed to be enforcing them. The snow finally started to loosen its grip in March. The plows came through one last time in mid-March after a late storm that dropped 4 inches, which everybody agreed was exhausting and unnecessary. The ice on the roads thinned out. People started clearing the snow off their porches and thinking about spring. I saw Carol across the street a few times over those weeks. We waved. We did not have long conversations, but we were civil. In the way you are civil with a neighbor who you have had a difficult history with but who still lives 30 feet away, and whose paper sometimes ends up in your yard and vice versa. She had apparently started working with a local garden club, which seemed like a much healthier outlet for her organizational instincts than HOA presidency. I noticed she had cleared her front walk pretty thoroughly after each storm, and her driveway was neat, and her heat was obviously working because the windows had that warm glow they get when a house is properly heated. On the last real cold night of winter, sometime in late March when the temperature dropped back to the 20s one more time before finally giving up, I stood out on my porch for a few minutes and looked at the street. Everything was quiet. The streetlights made halos in the cold air. Every house was lit from inside, everyone warm, everyone supplied with whatever they needed to keep their homes livable, including the Colonial across the street, including Carol Hollister, who had maybe learned something that winter, or maybe not, but who at least was warm, which was the important thing. I went back inside, turned up the thermostat just slightly, and made myself a cup of coffee. My heating system, topped off right up to the maximum by Pete's truck that January morning while Carol stood in my driveway fuming, was running exactly as it should. The HOA meeting minutes from the February board meeting, the first one under Sandra Pope, arrived in my email a week later. They were detailed, clearly written, and properly formatted. Every action item had a noted vote count. Every decision was traceable. They were honestly a pleasure to read, which is not something I ever expected to say about HOA board meeting minutes. I filed them with the rest of my documents, which I kept because you never know, and then I went on with my life. Spring was coming. The snow was melting. The neighborhood was in better shape than it had been in years. $42 and change in interest was credited back to the Nuyens, who bought a very nice bottle of wine and left it on my porch with a card that said thanks, neighbor, which is honestly one of the best things anyone has ever given me. I put the wine in a good spot and saved it for a night when the heat was running and the neighborhood was quiet and things felt approximately right. That night came in April, right around the time the last of the snow finally disappeared from the shadowed side of the Beckers' new garden bed. I opened the bottle, poured a glass, and sat by the window looking out at Birchwood Lane, at the quiet street and the warm houses and the neighborhood that had, against some odds, figured out how to take care of itself. It had taken a propane heater, a security camera, several hundred pages of HOA documents, one heating oil truck, and one very stubborn January cold snap to get there. But it had gotten there. And that all of it started because Carol Hollister walked out of her house one Tuesday morning and put her hands up in front of an orange oil truck, absolutely certain she had the right to do it, and found out, over the course of one very cold, very educational winter, that being board president did not mean being above the rules. It never does, and the people who forget that usually end up finding out the hard way. Carol found out in the most literal way possible. Which, honestly, was kind of perfect.